Well, turn back with me to 1 Peter and chapter 4, and we're going to spend the next little bit of time, I won't tell you how long, in those verses that I read earlier on. And you might be thinking that jumping in at chapter 4 of a fairly short letter is an odd thing to do. I'd like to do the whole book, but that would either mean me coming back for the next 3 months or a very long morning. So I've had to pick a little bit. And the reason I like this section that we're looking at this morning is because it's written all about life. Now, our life, granted, will be very different to the original readers' lives. And in fact, the last 2 years of our lives have been very different to really anything that we've known before. But this idea of Christian living, especially in a non-Christian world, doesn't change regardless of what else is going on. We are aliens in a place that is not our home. And so it's something that we need to hear and something we need to remember in our day-to-day lives. So, introduction, what's going on in the situation that Peter writes to? He's writing to scattered people. This is not a letter to a particular church or group, but it's to believers who are facing persecution. And by all accounts, it isn't too bad at the moment. They're getting on loosely okay, but things are only going in one direction. Nero is the newly crowned emperor, and if you know anything about that period of history, it's going to get very hard for believers in the coming years. And I think that's not too dissimilar to us, especially here in the UK. Things, generally speaking, aren't too bad, especially when you look at some places in the world. But for us too, it seems to be going one way. It's getting harder. And Peter's message is for people who are facing hard days ahead. It's not bad, he says, but it's not forever. Our lives are short, the Bible tells us that we are here one day and gone the next. But the real reason that Peter says it's not forever is because Jesus is coming back. He writes in verse 7, the end of things is at hand. And Peter wants us to be ready for that end. And maybe you're sitting here this morning and you're ready for the end of the pandemic. I know I certainly am. And it seems like maybe we're nearly there. To begin with, there were unending restrictions to keep us safe. Then there was the good news of the vaccination and that being rolled out, and gradually the restrictions got less and less. And if you're anything like me, you start compiling a mental list of the things that you'll be able to do again that you've had to wait for. Now, Peter says it's a similar process to getting ready for Jesus to return. He gives us in this passage 2 ways that we can be ready. Firstly, he tells us to reject sin, and secondly, to serve God. And he's writing this for believers. It's something he thinks they need to know. And so that must apply to us as well as believers. Imagine with me a line of history, and we start off with creation, then pretty quickly the fall, Exodus, Judges, Kings, and eventually we get to Jesus, his first coming. He comes to earth as a man and he dies on the cross. The cross is the big central point in history. And then we carry on into the New Testament with Peter and Paul, then medieval times, then the Reformation, then there's you and me here this morning. Wave to you and me. We're here this morning. And then after that, there's the second big event. There's Jesus coming back. But the problem is there's no scale on this bottom axis for time. It's certain it is coming, but it could be at any time after where we're up to now. The whole New Testament tells us that Jesus is coming back, and that when he does, it will be great. There will be a new heaven and a new earth created perfect. We'll have new resurrection bodies that won't fail and break and that won't be susceptible to viruses. But most of all, the best thing is that we will be with God forever in that relationship we were created to have. And it's no wonder, is it, that those people that live their lives in really tough situations are just longing for his return. But the problem is, for those not in tough times, if you have a fairly easy life, well, that can easily lead to forgetting this second event that we're heading towards. We know it's coming eventually, but it stops becoming such a big deal and we don't really expect it to be any time soon. Now, Peter's message for us this morning is that it could be at any time, and we need to be ready. The first way he gives us to be ready is to reject sin, that constant battle that we face. It would be great, wouldn't it, if we came to know Jesus, we trusted in him, and that was it. We didn't sin anymore. The struggle was over. But it's just not like that. It's a constant decision each day to keep fighting with sin. Peter's already written in this letter that sin wages war against our soul. Paul laments in his writing that he does the things that he longs not to do, and he can't do the things that he does want to do. One of the difficulties I think we face is that there are just so many ways for us to fall and sin. When we're fighting hard on one front, we face attacks from many other sides. I don't know if you've ever watched American wrestling on TV. Bear with me, this is going somewhere. But I used to watch this when I was growing up, and it used to feel to me that there was one guy, he'd got the other guy in the corner, he was building up to the final blow, he was getting the crowd going, he was doing all of this because what he didn't know was there was another guy had sneaked into the ring behind him with a folded up chair. It was always a chair, I never knew why, ready, sneaking up behind him to crack him round the back of the head with it. And that's what fighting sin can feel like. You can win on one side and you think you've got it sorted because you don't know what's behind you with a chair. You'd like to think that one day you'd make it. I remember a guy you might have heard of called Michael Green. He was an author, pastor, and a great evangelist, so much so that he was actually the main speaker at a mission week I was involved in at the age of 83. And he was asked one night at one of the meetings after he'd spoken, somebody asked him what it was like to have been a Christian for so long, and if he'd reached just a point where it was so ingrained in his life that he didn't struggle anymore. He knew Jesus and had done for a long time. When did that happen? When did he reach that point? Well, Michael Green looked back, smiled, and very winsomely said, "All I can tell you is that it happens after 83 years." Because we never win. That's not a point we reach in this life. The good news is that we don't have to win, but we do have to keep fighting. Now, Peter gives us 3 things to look to encourage us in that fight. Firstly, in verses 1 and 2, he tells us to look to the cross. "Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. Jesus suffered physically. That's what he means by in the flesh. He was beaten, he was battered, he was humiliated, and finally he was crucified. And on the cross, that's where he was battling sin, not his own, but yours and mine. And finally he cries out, "It is finished." He's won. It's over. The battle is done. Peter writes in chapter 3 of this letter, Christ suffered once for sins, and after that, it was done. It had no power left. And he says that we need that same approach, that same resolve to fight. If you're ever tempted to think that sin doesn't matter, then look at the cost that was paid to defeat it. Look to the cross where Jesus, the Saviour, was broken for you. And we'd like to think, wouldn't we, that, well, we're not that bad. We don't do lots of bad things, lots of sin. Or we look to others and we think, well, we don't do that, we don't do their sin. But then it comes, it tempts you. And maybe you think, well, this one is okay. It doesn't really matter, does it? Especially through these last couple of years of lockdown when we're just not together, you think, well, no one will know. They can't see me. Look to the cross each day. Make that decision that you're going to get off the canvas and go another round. How? Verse 2, live no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. That's the choice that we have to keep making. Do you want to live for yourself or for the God who died for you? And the second thing to look at is to look at our own lives in verses 3 and 4. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. When he died for us, Jesus gave us a better way to live. He bore our curse. He took our punishment. He took the wrath of God that we deserved. Peter says, look at your life before then, before you knew Jesus, when you were living in sensuality, passions, idolatry, all the things he lists. And maybe you're thinking, well, none of those things apply to me. Or fill in what's missing for you. If you think back to your life before you knew Jesus, when you were living in sin, you won't be short of things that you could list. That past life, he says, that was enough time to devote to sin, to do what the Gentiles want to do. And maybe you weren't that bad. You grew up in a Christian home. Maybe there's even not really a point where you can remember not knowing Jesus. Well, you still sinned, and you still do now. But maybe you're the other way. You grew up bad. Verse 3 is virtually describing your life. And then you found Jesus. Now, Peter writes that the Gentiles, he means the world, people apart from the believers, they tell you, do what you want to do. If it feels right, if it's right for you, then do it. Don't let anybody stop you from being you. We were rescued at great cost from this sin-filled life. Why would you want to go back to that? A few years ago, you might remember, the American politician John McCain died. He was the guy that lost the election to Barack Obama and was a senator for many years. But before that, he was a prisoner of war in the Vietnam War. His plane crashed leaving him with 2 broken arms and a broken leg. And he was hauled off to prison and not treated. Throughout his time there, he was regularly beaten, he was starved, he was kept in solitary confinement in complete darkness. At one point, he was dragged from his cell and beaten every 2 hours, all day, every day. And finally, after about 5.5 years, he was freed. And you imagine going to him and saying, you know what you went through there? Would you want to go back and do a bit more of that, do another few years? You'd have to be absolutely nuts, wouldn't you, to choose to go back to that. Now, Peter's saying that is what life is like when you are trapped under sin. It might not feel like it. The lie of sin is that it's good and that it's fun, but really, you're trapped under it. The Gentiles, the world, say, don't let anybody deny you what you want. But it's just so destructive and damaging for you and for others around you. The wonderful message of Jesus is a way to be free from that sin. Why would you want to go back to being captive to it and to being under God's wrath? But verse 4, with respect to this, they are surprised when you don't join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. People will hate you for being different. You won't be like them and join in. They'll malign you. They'll mark you out as different. They'll say, oh, him, he's a Christian, he's one of them. He's not going to join in with this. But you are different, and you must be different, because he's coming back. And the third thing to look at is his return in verses 5 and 6. But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached, even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. So when he comes, he's coming as a judge. And when you stand in that courtroom, he knows everything. He's seen you fight, he's seen you win, he's seen you lose, and he's seen you cling to Christ to pay for your debt. He's not just you, he's seen everyone, even those who are now dead. They heard the gospel as well. They fought, they clung to Christ. And when he returns, he comes physically, he comes bodily. 1 Thessalonians says that the dead in Christ are raised first. They needed the gospel, they need the gospel, because they will face him as well. On that day, when it comes, whenever it comes, you have to be ready. They face him just the same as we do. There's no escaping that when it comes. We must be ready, and to do that, we must reject sin and keep fighting to reject it each day. So then, what do we do instead? We're to serve God. The slight caveat for this second section is that it is written at a different time, but it's still applicable. It's just a bit different. So your challenge this morning is to think, what do these things look like for us today? And especially, I think, what do they look like in the aftermath of the pandemic and lockdown of the last few years? He gives us 4 things. Firstly, prayer. The end of all things is at hand, therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. It's not a shock, this one, is it? If you were thinking of things that Peter might list, you'd probably have prayer fairly high up there. But what's different, I think, is what Peter says about it. He says you must pray for each other, to uphold each other, that we continue to fight. In order to do that, we need to be self-controlled and sober-minded. We needed to be controlled in order to actually pray. If you're anything like me, you'll find that that doesn't come naturally. It's not easy. One of my great heroes is Charles Spurgeon, and I remember reading something that he wrote about prayer not that long ago. Well, he wrote it long ago. I read it not that long ago. He wrote that when he prayed, he only ever prayed for 10 minutes at a time. And he said that even for just that small amount of time, he found that other thoughts started to invade his mind and interrupt his prayer. I just find that tremendously encouraging, because that's exactly what happens to me. But the important thing was, he prayed, only for 10 minutes, but regularly. And to do that, we need to know what people's needs are. We need to know what's going on in their lives so we can pray meaningly for them. Because when we do that, God always answers. There are 5 ways that God answers your prayers. Sometimes he says yes. Sometimes he says no. Sometimes he says not yet. Sometimes he says do it yourself. It can be a dangerous thing to pray honestly. And sometimes he says you don't need to know that. They're the ways he answers prayer, but he always answers. Think of 3 people that are close to you. Do you know what to pray for them this week? Do you know what's going on in their lives? Think of 3 people in church this morning, maybe those that you don't know that well. Do you know what to pray for them? So we can pray generally for anyone, but it's better to pray knowingly. When they share something with you, tell them that you're praying for them. That's really important, especially when we don't see people perhaps as regularly as we used to or normally would. Find out how you can pray for people and then do it. And the second thing we are to do is to love. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Again, it's an obvious one, but the key is to keep loving. Why do we have to be told to keep loving? Well, because it can be hard work sometimes. One commentary I read summed love up as the choice to do good for others, regardless of the cost to yourself. And it can be like that because some people are just really hard for us to love. We all have people like that. And I hate to break it to you, but you're that person for somebody else. Why do we love? Because it covers a multitude of sins. We're not loving them to hide our own sin. It's to hide theirs from our sight. It allows us to love them even when it's hard work. It allows you to forgive and overlook. The author Tim Lane sums forgiveness up as not bringing it up with them, not bringing it up later with God, and not bringing it up with yourself over and over. I don't know about you, but when I replay things over and over, I tend to win and decide I was right every time. It's only love that can allow you to let go and to do that. So love people. Now they get a bit more tricky. The third one is hospitality in verse 9. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. And how do we do that in a world of restrictions, even if we are feeling really close to the end of that? It's not easy, but there are ways. But really, I think this is a lesson that will help us in lots of areas, even when all this is over and we can do normal hospitality. The fact is, at the moment, most people are not likely to just walk into church. But then they wouldn't do that normally anyway. Some people will, and that's great, but for the vast majority of people, they're not going to come in. We have to show them what it's like inside through those back doors before they'll come in and join us. Otherwise, most people probably never will. See, church and the Christians in it are an outpost in enemy territory. It's that idea of living as aliens in a world that's not our home. We have to show the gospel through our words, our actions, through our whole lives. Welcome people into that wherever you can, not just physically into your home. Let people join you, and do that enthusiastically, not grudgingly. There's no point inviting somebody to join you for something and then just sitting there looking bored and disinterested until they leave. Be hospitable, and you won't always be on your A game. You'll be tired, you'll find it a struggle, but when you do, there's love to help cover those failings. And the final thing Peter says we should do is service. Verses 10 and 11, he writes, "As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks oracles of God. Whoever serves, as one who serves by the strength that God supplies." Well, that's also something that's quite difficult to do at the moment. Lots of churches just aren't doing that much. So how do we serve as a church, or just as individuals in general? What do we serve in? Well, if you think about it, there's no shortage of things that you can do to serve others. In fact, if you can't find one, I'd suggest that you're just not looking hard enough. Because service, at its most basic level, is finding a need, whatever that is, wherever it is, and meeting it. Peter gives us two main areas to do that. He says, whoever speaks, and yes, to an extent, that is, people like me or Darren who do word ministry. But encouragement, care, love, support, they're all things that are shown through words. So think this morning, who doesn't talk to anyone in the average week between Sundays? Maybe whatever they used to have can't happen at the moment. Maybe they never had anything. Can you meet that need this week? And then the second way is whoever serves. That's the physical enactment of the words. It doesn't get more generic than that, really. He's saying, do something. Serve others, whoever you can, however you can, and whenever you can. And do all of this, verse 11, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. So today, this morning, are you ready for it to be over? Remember Michael Green, you don't reach a plateau, you're never there. The actor Arnold Ridley, who's probably best known for playing Godfrey in Dad's Army, used to say to friends, when I die, I want to break a contract. He died at age 88 in the middle of the run of a stage production he was in every night. That's the attitude Peter says we must have. The end is near, whether that's through death or through Jesus' return. We must be ready, but also busy until it does happen. See, we can easily do one and not the other, or we can mistake one thing for being both of them. We can be ready and waiting and focusing so much looking forward that we do nothing, or we can be so busy doing things now that we're just not ready. We are to be ready for him to return, longing for it to happen. But until then, we're to keep praying, loving, welcoming, and serving before time runs out. Amen. We're going to hear the final song this morning before we close.